We've already met Polycarp, the early 2nd century bishop of Smyrna, twice. Once in a letter that Ignatius sent to him, and once in a letter that he himself sent to the Christians of Philippi. Polycarp is best known in history, however, from a book that was written about him, specifically about his arrest, trial, and martyrdom. The martyrdom of Polycarp is the earliest account of a Christian martyrdom that we have from outside the New Testament. Within the New Testament, we do have an instance of a Christian martyrdom narrated in the book of Acts of the Apostles. This involves the killing of the Christian Stephen at the hands of a Jewish mob. It's a very interesting account for reasons that we'll be picking up on later. Namely that the death of Stephen isn't the result of a judicial trial so much as a result of a mob violence. In the book of Acts, in chapters 6 and 7, we're told about the martyrdom of Stephen. Stephen was a Hellenistic Jew, meaning he was a Jew who was not raised in Palestine, but grew up outside of Palestine in the we don't know where, but elsewhere in the Hellenistic world, the Greek world, who had come to Jerusalem and had become one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. We're told in Acts chapter 6 that Stephen was full of grace and power, and he did wonders and signs among the people. The book of Acts, as I've intimated earlier in this course, is not a objective historical account of what happened to early Christianity. It's actually an account that is based on theological assumptions of the author. And here you see theology at work in the description that Stephen was a great miracle worker. The story goes on to say that there were non-Christian Jews who stood up to argue with Stephen, but they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. So clearly this isn't a disinterested portrayal of Stephen. This is from a Christian perspective. His opponents then secretly instigated some men to say that we have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and God. They stirred up the people of the Jews, and they called forth false witnesses who said that Stephen never stops saying things against this holy place and against the law. So these non-Christian Jews are accusing the Christian Stephen of being opposed to the Jewish law and to the Jewish temple. And so he's brought in before the Jewish council to make an account of himself. And chapter 7 of the book of Acts is actually a speech by Stephen in which he recounts the history of Israel down to his present day. He concludes his speech after summarizing what he sees to be important parts of the history of Israel with some rather inflammatory words. Stephen says, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you're forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do." So his summary of the history of Israel was the summary of former Israelites opposing God, and he's saying, you're doing just the same thing. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, meaning Jesus, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. So he's blaming these Jewish people for murdering Jesus. You are the ones that received the laws ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it. Well, they don't like hearing this, as you can imagine. They become enraged. They grind their teeth at Stephen. He, however, is filled with the Spirit and looks up into heaven and has a vision of Jesus standing by the right hand of God. When he announces that he's looking up into the heavenly places, they take this as a blasphemy, and they cover their ears, and with a loud shout they all rushed together against him. They dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. And so then they stone him to death. This is an act of mob violence against Stephen because he's making a Christian proclamation. This it was the first instance that we have of a Christian martyrdom. It's found within the New Testament. The first account of a martyrdom outside the New Testament is the martyrdom of Polycarp. Now, I'm not saying that Polycarp was the first Christian martyred after New Testament times. Ignatius, for example, was martyred much earlier. Ignatius was martyred about 40 years before Polycarp. So just so we're on the same chronological page here, Ignatius wrote a letter to Polycarp on his way to martyrdom, when Ignatius was on his way to martyrdom, about the year 110, when Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna. Polycarp remained the bishop of Smyrna for another 45 years. So he was obviously a very young man when Ignatius knew him. Polycarp's martyrdom took place probably around the year 155, and so he had a long and distinguished career as the bishop of Smyrna. So his was not the first instance of martyrdom in early Christianity, but we don't have an actual account of Ignatius's martyrdom except in later legendary sources. In Polycarp's case, we have what appears to be an actual first-hand account of his arrest, trial, and execution. In his case, unlike Stephen's, the martyrdom of Polycarp is an official act. A Roman governor actually orders his death, and then there's an official execution. This martyrology, this account of a martyrdom, raises broad questions for us about the persecution of Christians by Roman authorities in the first 2 centuries. The questions will be such things as, why were Christians persecuted and sometimes martyred? Did they practice an illegal religion? And if Christianity was not illegal, why were Christians sometimes tortured and killed for being Christian? And how often did this happen? And where did it happen? Now, in the next lecture, we'll be dealing with some of these broader questions. In the present lecture, I want to focus on our earliest surviving martyrology, the martyrdom of Polycarp, to see what it can tell us about such things. The record of Polycarp's arrest, trial, and execution, like the account in the book of Acts of Stephen's death, is not a disinterested historical narrative. It's not written by somebody who wants to give the facts and only the facts. He portrays this martyrdom from a very Christian point of view. He has a distinct agenda in presenting this martyrdom, as we'll see. At the same time, it appears to be based on an eyewitness report. This isn't something written decades later, which was the case in Acts. Acts was written decades after Stephen's death. In this case, it's based on a contemporary account. The account is found in a letter that was written from the Christians of Smyrna, so Polycarp's own church, to the Christians of the church of Philomelium, which was another town in Asia Minor. And so just to read you the beginning of this to set the context. It begins as a letter does. The church of God that temporarily resides in Smyrna to the church of God that temporarily resides in Philomelium. The reason they say that the church temporarily resides there is because, not that the church is going to up and move somewhere else, but the idea is that Christians don't belong to this world. Christians are just pilgrims in this world, and this is where they are sojourning, but their real home is in heaven. So they're temporarily residing here, but their real home is with God. So this is a letter from Smyrna to Philomelium, and to all the congregations of temporary residents, in other words, of Christians everywhere, who belong to the holy and universal church. We know nothing about the particular author of this letter. It's written by the church, but obviously somebody sat down and wrote the letter. One person wrote the letter. The only thing we know about the author is his name. As it turns out, his name is Marcion, as we're told at the end of the book. But this is not the same Marcion that I've been talking about in this course. This is not the heretic Marcion. This is just some unknown person named Marcion. It was a common name. Some unknown person named Marcion who happened to be a Christian in the church of Smyrna. As I've indicated, the letter appears to have been written soon after the event itself. And it's not just an objective description, but it has a clear theological agenda, as is manifest at the very beginning of the account, where the author says, "We are writing you, brothers, about those who were martyred, along with the blessed Polycarp, who put an end to the persecution by, as it were, setting a seal on it through his death as a martyr." Okay, so we get some valuable historical information there. There appears to have been a persecution of Christians in Smyrna that had led to some martyrdoms, and Polycarp, the bishop, was the last one martyred. Okay, that's all it gives us, but that tells us something about what was going on. But then the author shows his hand with respect to how he's going to discuss this martyrdom of Polycarp. For nearly everything leading up to Polycarp's death occurred so that the Lord might show us from above a martyrdom in conformity with the gospel. This account will show that Polycarp's death was in accordance with the gospel. Now, what does he mean by that? He appears to mean that Polycarp's death was in imitation of the death of Christ. In other words, this is an example of the phenomenon I talked about in an earlier lecture, the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ by the Christian martyrs. This book is trying to show that Polycarp's death was very much like Jesus' death in the Gospels of the New Testament. And so, as it turns out, a number of details in his account conform with the stories as we have them in the Gospels about Jesus' death. Just to give you some examples. In this account of Polycarp's death, he knows in advance that he's going to die. Just as Jesus predicts he's going to die, Polycarp predicts that he's going to die, that he's going to be martyred, and he predicts how he's going to die. How he's going to die. He's going to die by being burned at the stake, just as Jesus predicted that he would be crucified. Polycarp is betrayed by the people who are close to him, just as Jesus was betrayed by one of his own disciples. Polycarp prays to God before he is arrested, and he prays that God's will be done, just as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Thy will be done." The arresting officer in this particular account, oddly enough, is someone named Herod, just as Herod, the king, was involved with Jesus' death in the Gospel, especially the Gospel of Luke. Polycarp rides into town, going into town for his martyrdom on a donkey, just as Jesus, the last week of his life, rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and so forth. There are numerous parallels between Polycarp's death and Jesus' death that this author is bringing out. And he's bringing them out for a theological reason, to show that this particular death was a death in accordance with the gospel. In other words, this was an imitatio Christi, an imitation of Christ. The implication being that this is the kind of death that you yourself ought to seek to emulate. This is the way to die if you have to die as a Christian. The account begins with the martyrdoms or the near martyrdoms of other Christians in the community of Smyrna. As they say in chapter 2, "Blessed and noble, therefore, are all the martyrdoms that have occurred according to the will of God." And then this author goes on to give you some details about some of these earlier martyrdoms by describing in some graphic detail the torments that these other Christians from Smyrna underwent. "For who would not be astounded by their nobility, endurance, and love of the Master? For they endured even when their skin was ripped to shreds by whips, revealing the very anatomy of their flesh, down to the inner veins and arteries, while bystanders felt pity and wailed." This sounds like something from Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, where it's interesting that, in fact, the Gospels of the New Testament don't give a blow-by-blow account of Jesus' death, but this gives some gory detail that, in fact, would be grist for Mel Gibson's mill. But they displayed such nobility, these people who were being flogged within an inch of their lives, that none of them either grumbled or moaned, clearly showing us all that in that hour, while under torture, the martyrs of Christ had journeyed far away from the flesh, or rather that the Lord was standing by speaking to them. So they don't even moan or groan or complain while they're being flogged within an inch of their lives. Why is it that these people can be so strong in the face of such torture? It's because Christ is standing beside them and they're looking to Him. Moreover, they are supported supernaturally and theologically in their time of suffering. They have it's not just that God is providing them with support, they also have a theological reason for knowing that they're going to actually survive this torment. So he says in verse 3, "Clinging to the gracious gift of Christ, they despised the torments of the world, in 1 hour purchasing for themselves eternal life." In other words, they're reasoning, this torture is going to go on for an hour, but I'm going to live eternally. And so for them, that was a worthwhile exchange. And the fire in their inhuman torturers was cold to them, because they kept their eyes on the goal of escaping the fire that is eternal and never extinguished. And with the eyes of their heart, they looked above to the good things preserved for those who endure, so that they know that they're going to be eternally rewarded for experiencing such an inhuman death, and so they put up with it valiantly. The clear message is that when subjected to this kind of harsh treatment, Christians are to face it boldly. And the author gives an example of how this is to take place with one particular martyr from Smyrna, a man named Germanicus. Germanicus, in chapter 3, apparently was an old man and who was being thrown to the wild beasts. The proconsul, in other words, the governor who was in charge of the Roman affairs in Smyrna, the proconsul tried to persuade Germanicus not to go through with it. He said to Germanicus, "Take pity on your age." In other words, he wants Germanicus to recant from being a Christian so he doesn't have to suffer like this. He's saying, "Look, you're an old man. Take account of your old age." And instead of paying attention to the proconsul, Germanicus forcefully dragged the wild beast onto himself, wanting to leave their unjust and lawless life without delay. So this sounds a lot like Ignatius, who was eager for the wild beast to attack him, and he says that if they don't attack him right away, he'll coax them on to it. Well, Germanicus is one who does exactly that. At the same time that this author is clearly celebrating the noble martyrdom of the Christians, he wants to make another point, which is that Christians should not seek out martyrdom. If they're going to be subjected to martyrdom, they should subject themselves to it. If it's going to happen, they should allow it to happen and look to God while it's happening. But they shouldn't try to be martyred. And he gives a reason for this, namely that there have been some people who have sought out martyrdom who have turned the coward at the last moment. And he points out a particular person named Quintus, who was a young person who had compelled both himself and others to turn themselves in. But the insistent pleas of the proconsul convinced him to take the oath and offer a sacrifice. So what's going on here is that these Christians have a way out. If they don't want to die, all they have to do is make a sacrifice to the Roman gods, which probably means nothing more than taking a handful of incense and throwing it on the fire on an altar for the sake of one of the gods, or maybe for the emperor. That's all they have to do, and they won't be punished. So we'll see in the next lecture what that's all about, why if they sacrifice they no longer need to be punished. But in any event, it's a very simple thing, and this Quintus decided that he would be a macho Christian, and so he turns himself in, wanting to be martyred, but when it came down to it and he saw the wild beasts, he chickened out and performed the sacrifice and got off the hook. And so this author concludes, "Because of this, brothers, we do not praise those who hand themselves over, since this is not what the gospel teaches." Jesus didn't hand himself over, he waited to be betrayed. So don't turn yourself in. If they catch you, they catch you. But don't go out of your way to make it happen. Well, when this happens with Germanicus, when Germanicus dies, the crowds see this and they're incensed that this old man has dragged this beast upon himself to die, and they cry out, "Away with the atheists, find Polycarp." In other words, they know Polycarp's the leader of this group. Let's get him and just take care of this by killing the leader. And so they go out to try and find Polycarp to arrest him. What follows then is a detailed account of how Polycarp died, which is used to show the example of how one ought to die. Polycarp himself, as we find out in chapter 5, did not seek to be martyred. He didn't turn himself in, and in fact, when they go looking for him, he is persuaded by some of his church members to leave town. And so he actually leaves town and goes out to a country house, and he stays in this small country house not far from the city, where he spends his days and nights praying, as was his custom. But then he has a dream in which he sees his pillow burning, and he concludes from this dream that he's going to be burned alive, and that in fact is what is going to happen. The administrative officers are out trying to find him. They can't find him. Finally, they track down a couple of his slaves, and they torture his household slaves to discover his whereabouts. In the ancient world, torture was commonly used as a way of acquiring information. The ancients had a different understanding of pain than we have. Our understanding of pain is that if you're experiencing pain, you'll just tell your torturer anything he wants to hear. In the ancient world, the understanding was pain takes you so close to the edge of reality that in pain you are more likely to tell the truth because it brings you to the edge of your existence. And so there was actually Roman laws requiring you to torture slaves so that you would get the truth out of them, which is just the opposite of what we would think. You'd think they'd just tell them whatever they wanted to know. But in any event, in the ancient world, slaves were required to be tortured in order to get information. So they find some slaves of Polycarp, household slaves, they torture them, and they divulge then his whereabouts. One of the surprising features of this martyrdom of Polycarp is to discover that, as in the case with Germanicus, the officials who arrest Polycarp do their best in order to try and get Polycarp off the hook. They don't really want to kill him. People might have an image of Romans out for Christian blood, but when you read the actual accounts, even the accounts when the Christians write the accounts, it's quite clear. The officials don't want to kill the Christians. They just want them to repent and behave by worshiping the right gods and giving up the worship of their God so that they don't have to be tortured like this. And so this is what happens in the martyrdom of Polycarp. I mentioned that the chief of police is a fellow named Herod, and Herod, once Polycarp is arrested, tries to persuade him, saying, "Why is it so wrong to save yourself by saying, 'Caesar is Lord,' and making a sacrifice," and so on. So the Christians who say Jesus is Lord have to deny that Jesus is Lord and have to admit Caesar is my Lord. For the Romans trying to elicit these confessions, this is a political statement. If you say Jesus is Lord, you're saying that Caesar's not your Lord. That's a political statement. You're not under the authority of Caesar. Well, you need to be under the authority of Caesar if you're going to live in Caesar's empire. So you have to acknowledge Caesar as your master. No, I have only one master, Christ. Caesar has to be your master or we're going to kill you. I have one master who's Christ. I'm a Christian. Boom, off to the lions. Herod says, why would it matter if you just say Caesar? Just say it. And Polycarp refuses to say it. Then when Polycarp is put on trial, he's brought into the arena, and the proconsul, the local governor, also tries to get him off the hook. The proconsul began trying to persuade Polycarp. So Polycarp's in the middle of the arena, and the proconsul's on a seat up in the stands, and there are people in the stands all around the arena. And the proconsul is more or less putting him on trial and trying to get him to persuade him to make a denial, saying, "Have respect for your age," and the other things they customarily say, he says, "Swear by the fortune of Caesar and repent. Say, away with the atheists." What he means by that are away with the Christians. Christians, oddly enough, were considered atheists in the ancient world. Atheists? Yeah, atheists, because they didn't worship the gods. They were without the gods. Atheists. And so Polycarp is said, just say away with the atheists. But Polycarp looked with a stern face at the entire crowd of lawless Gentiles in the stadium, and gesturing to them with his hand, he sighed, looking up to heaven, and said, "Away with the atheists." So he turns it on them. He looks at the crowds and says, "These are the atheists. Away with them." So these authorities are trying to get them off the hook, showing that the Romans, in fact, were not out for Christian blood. This also shows, interestingly, what the crime of the Christians was. The crime of the Christians was not having practiced Christianity. It was being unwilling to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Roman state and its gods. See, if the crime was having been a Christian, they would kill them anyway. I mean, if you've committed murder, you can't later say, okay, I'm sorry, and then get off the hook. But if you were a Christian, you can say, okay, I'm sorry, and get off the hook. So having been a Christian wasn't a crime. The crime was refusing to worship the state gods. Moreover, this entire account shows that in particular, the leaders weren't interested in killing these people. It was the mobs, the Gentile and Jewish, in this case, mobs that were intent on the Christians dying. We'll see the significance of that in the next lecture. Being killed for confessing Christ, or admitting to being a Christian, then, is a shorthand way of expressing what the crime is. If you say, I am a Christian, it means I am not one who's willing to acknowledge Caesar as master. This account also shows why Christians could take comfort while facing such awful tortures. These Christians believed that they would be rewarded eternally and their persecutors would face eternal torment. Polycarp also, like his predecessors, views the tortures of the moment to be nothing in comparison with the rewards that will be awaiting him if he goes through with a faithful sacrifice. And so eventually Polycarp is executed by being burned at the stake. The crowds want him to be thrown to the wild beasts, and it's a kind of an interesting moment in the story because the crowds call out for him to be thrown to the beasts, but the proconsul says that part of the day's entertainment is over. And so he can't throw in the wild beast because they've already done that. And so there are set times when you have certain parts. See, you have gladiatorial, you have the hours for the gladiatorial contest. You have the hours for the criminals to be thrown to the wild beast. You have the hours for executions, and the hour for the wild beast is up. Sorry, we can't do it that way. So they call out for him to be burned at the stake. And so the proconsul approves this death. We're told, interestingly, that the crowds then go out and gather firewood because they're all eager for this to happen. So they go out and get firewood, and we're told that the Jews in particular were excited to gather the firewood. This is showing that just as in the case of Jesus, this author is portraying Jews as being particularly culpable for the death of Polycarp. Polycarp, though, is in full assurance that God is on his side. And as it turns out, when we read the account, God really is on Polycarp's side. When they try to burn Polycarp at the stake, they build the pyre around him, and he says he doesn't need to be tied to the stake, or doesn't need to be nailed to the stake. He's not going to go anywhere, he says. And so they light the fire, but instead of consuming his body, what happens is the fire forms a shell around him that looks like sails on a sailboat around him and don't touch his body. And instead of the smell of reeking flesh, it's a smell of perfume that wafts from the pyre. So this is God sort of supernaturally protecting his martyr. But eventually, so he's being burned at the stake, but he's not burning. Then they ask an executioner to go up, and an executioner goes up and stabs him in the side to kill him. And we're told that so much blood comes out that it puts out the fire, and then a dove comes out of his side and flies up to heaven. And so this is a miraculous death of God's miraculous martyr. We can draw several conclusions about early Christian martyrdom from this account of Polycarp. The instigators of persecution in most of the martyrologies tend to be the pagan mobs. The charges against the Christians have to do with atheism. They refuse to worship the state gods. That's what they're at fault for. Officials become involved in these martyrdoms only when they're compelled to do so, and then they get involved somewhat reluctantly. So these, by and large, are acts of mob violence. And the reason, as we'll see in the next lecture, they're acts of mob violence is because Christianity, technically speaking, was not illegal. It was against policy not to worship the state gods, but Christianity in itself was never declared an illegal religion in this period. Christians evidenced a range of reactions to their persecution and potential martyrdoms. Some Christians turned themselves in, some went into hiding, some recanted when given the opportunity, some went through with it. There was a range of reactions, and they developed a range of theological reflections on the significance of their opposition. Throughout the martyrdom of Polycarp, it's clear that ultimately behind his death is the devil himself. but it's also clear that God would provide divine succor to those who are faithful and an angelic existence afterwards. These temporary torments are seen as nothing in comparison to the eternal damnation that awaits those who reject Christ, so that it's worth suffering temporarily. All of this, then, we can learn from the martyrdom of Polycarp, which is our earliest Christian martyrology to survive and one of the most interesting writings of the Apostolic Fathers.